Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Kaylin Nicholson. Shama Sawant is unfortunately unable to be with us for this episode, but she'll be joining us again next week. With Pride Month about to kick off and events and celebrations in cities across the country, tonight we'll be discussing how queer community members and working and young people can fight back against the tidal wave of right-wing attacks against queer people in general and trans people in particular that have been ramping up in states across the nation over the past year. We need not just a defensive fight against new attacks, but also a fight to win positive, concrete demands that all working people, but especially queer people, urgently need, like free healthcare for all with gender-affirming care and affordable, high-quality housing for all. Additionally, we'll discuss how we need to connect the fight to end LGBTQ oppression to the fight to end the Israeli state's genocidal war on and occupation of Gaza, and turn Pride Month into an all-out protest against U.S. support for the war. All of this is connected to the urgent question of what those of us fighting against right-wing attacks and to end oppression should do this year in November in the presidential election. Tonight, I'll be speaking with Sophie Scholl, a member of Socialist Alternative and LGBTQ activist in Wisconsin, as well as Margot Stewart, a member of our very own On Strike team and an LGBTQ rights activist since college. Sophie will be joining us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and Margot is right here in the studio with me. Sophie and Margot are both members of Workers Strike Back. Sophie works as a chemist in pharmaceutical research and development and has helped bring new HIV drugs to the market. Before she moved to Seattle, Margot was part of the Stop the Station movement in Pittsburgh, fighting for community control over the police and funding for housing, healthcare, and education during the George Floyd Rebellion. Before we continue, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you've been watching On Strike, you know that we bring coverage, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to build our movement against the bosses and their political servants, and so that On Strike can continue to bring the kind of discussions about strategy needed to fight back and win. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. And now we'll go to Sophie in Milwaukee. Welcome to On Strike, Sophie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, Sophie, can you talk a little bit about the escalating attacks on the LGBTQ community and trans people in particular that we're seeing all over the country right now? Why do you think this is happening at this moment in history in particular?
Yeah, great question. What we're seeing right now is a slew of massive attacks on gender and bodily autonomy over the last few years. Since the overturn of Roe 2 years ago, 26 states have either totally banned or restricted abortion access, and more than 1,000 anti-trans bills have been put forward across 49 states since the beginning of 2023 alone, which is really crazy because that's like a year and a half ago. Um, the right wing is doing this in part because trans and queer people have played really key roles in social and like left political movements of the last decades. Things like Bernie Sanders, Justice for George Floyd, the Dobbs protests, etc. But also because they kind of view trans people as like a possible easy target to scapegoat as a way of drawing attention away from the fact that they really don't have anything to offer working class people insofar as like actually improving their lives. So they kind of just scream about drag queens and trans people and stuff, similar to how they're attacking migrants right now. Um, on top of having a really horrible impact on people's lives, which is, I think, obvious, these attacks are really confusing for tons of working and young people who are witnessing it. When you're seeing these attacks, it can be really easy to think that, like, oh my God, the whole world is against me or something like that, especially for like young trans people who are watching all of this happen and, having very real concerns about, like, what is my future going to look like? But the truth is, the attacks on abortion rights and the anti trans legislation are both actually unpopular according to numerous polls. And actually, a Fox News poll from around a year ago found that 60% of respondents, which is the Fox News poll, viewed banning books related to transgender issues as a major problem. So, like, not just a problem, but a major problem. And 57% thought that attacks on families with transgender children was a major problem as well, which was rated more often as a major problem than, for example, like trans women competing in women's sports, which only 49% of people thought was a major problem. And this includes 69% of Democratic identifying respondents, but also 43% of Republican respondents saying that attacks on trans families are a quote major problem. And so this shows that despite what these right-wing kind of culture war pundits who scream about protecting your children from the trans agenda and like all these traditional values, and despite what these people would like you to think, the truth is that most of the working class really does bear no real animosity or hostility towards like queer and trans people, even if sometimes they are confused about us at first or like somewhat unsure of what to think of us. And that's not to say that there aren't real prejudices that exist, but it's not how the majority of people feel. And I can personally speak to my experiences helping organize workers in the South through Workers Strike Back, which was really eye opening. We received a really warm welcome from working class people we met when doing that work, even when we were going door to door in working class neighborhoods or like unwinding at a random bar after a long day. There were a lot of trans femme people with us who were like visibly trans, and no one bothered us even when we were, using the bathroom, which is, something that the right wing would like to have you believe is just like some hugely contested, battleground. Instead, people were just like really nice to us and genuinely, welcoming regardless of how any of us looked. And so, the truth is that the majority of working people are disgusted and disturbed by the right wing attacks against trans people, especially, things like book bannings and the revocation of healthcare and attacks on trans children in schools. There's not really a broad support or consensus around these right wing ideas. Instead, there's a small, very loud part of the right wing that is really leading the charge on these attacks. And so, to me, the best way we can fight back against these right wing attacks, whether they're attempts to ban trans healthcare or, trans athletes or ban abortion or ban contraceptive access or, whatever, and all of these things are deeply connected, especially in the eyes of the right wing, we would need to fight back with the power of the working class. And most especially, we need the labor movement to take up the fight against all forms of oppression. I don't know if people remember, but a few years ago, there were workers at Activision Blizzard who had an organizing drive, and one of their core demands was an end to rampant sexual harassment that was taking place in the workplace. And so this is just like one example, but the point is that queer and trans people especially need to see the entire workers movement showing up to fight for our rights and well-being in a sense of solidarity, and that's actually going to do the most to reach many young trans people who might feel like isolated and like, oh, maybe like no one's going to stand up for me except like other trans people, which is absolutely not true, but it's unfortunately the conclusion that some people have drawn. It's of course true that like some people, like I said, do have real prejudices. I don't think anyone would deny that. But the best way to win over non-queer working people away from those ideas is to fight to build a principled unity on the basis of movements for, like fighting for working class demands that also stand against discrimination and oppression. And so, it's actually the same like right wing Republican led state legislatures that have pushed the anti trans and anti queer bills that are at the forefront of the most virulent and blatant attacks on the labor movement. Just look at how Republican governors from 6 states openly ganged up against UAW and the auto workers fighting to unionize with them recently. And so, at the root of this is the understanding that some of the main issues affecting trans people historically and now are things like healthcare, housing, and wages, which are similarly affecting all working people. And there's a very organic basis on which to fight back against these right wing attacks on trans people through working class solidarity and the continuation of militant workplace struggles fighting for workers' most basic demands. And so to me, that's the real answer, is building working class movements to fight back against these attacks, but to also go on the offensive and to build a movement to win real gains for both trans people specifically and the working class as a whole. And that understanding is at the heart of why Workers Strike Back took up the fight to end discrimination and oppression, as well as demands around wages, healthcare, and unionization as part of its core demands when it was launched.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sophie. And, I really agree with what you were saying, the really central role that the labor movement has to play in providing a lead in not just fighting back against the attacks, but as we said in the beginning, fighting for offensive demands, fighting for concrete gains for things that working people in general, but particularly queer people need. And of course, I think one of the main things right now, one of the main things that has come under attack in recent years is access to gender-affirming care. And of course, healthcare is something that for working people broadly is just woefully insufficient, far too expensive in many cases. What would you say to someone who, for instance, was advocating that their union take up a demand for trans-inclusive or gender-affirming care to be explicitly listed as a demand in a contract campaign? And, one argument that we frequently hear, I think, when there are rank and file union members wanting their union to take a stand on issues like this is, oh, well, that's divisive. It'll undermine our ability to win the strongest possible contract if we try to weigh in on divisive political issues like this. But what would your response be, if there were a union member out there who wanted their union to take up the fight for gender-affirming care?
Yeah, I would say that to me, trans people aren't divisive. Transphobia is divisive, right? I think that trans people are a reality. There are trans people in my workplace besides me. You know what I mean? And granted, I work for, what is a pretty big company and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, the fact of the matter is that actually, the fight for like the best possible healthcare for trans people is actually not disconnected from, the fight for the best possible healthcare for, members of the union in general, right? For example, my healthcare, which I work in a non-union workplace, unfortunately, but my healthcare, it doesn't have like a special stipulation for, oh, and this is what we're going to cover for gender affirming stuff. It just covers it, right? And so, the goal should be for any union, right? Winning the, as long as healthcare is, not through some sort of universal single payer system, which ideally it would be, I would say that the goal would be to win the best possible healthcare coverage, and that means not leaving anyone behind, right? And I think that the attitude that, oh well, trans people are divisive and we would have to leave them behind, that actually weakens the position of the union, because like if I'm sitting there as a trans person being told by my union, like you're going to be left behind, we're not going to fight for your healthcare, well, that really isn't a great incentive for me to come and stick my neck out, right? And for me, I'm a socialist. I'll fight anyways. But yeah, if we want people to actually stick their neck out and fight for, the kind of, give the kind of fight that is going to be needed to um, to actually win these demands, I would say that. They need to feel like there's something in it for them that is going to really transform their lives if they actually fight and win, right? So I think that to some degree, yeah, you can make the argument that wages, hours, and conditions is the backbone of most unionization drives. Um, but I don't think we can take like a reductionist approach to these broad class-based demands and say like, oh well, that's the only thing we're going to talk about, right? I think that for me, like um, being trans, that's not the only healthcare need I have, but it is one of them. And to me, the fight to get that sort of healthcare, for the labor movement would be inseparable from any sort of other, coverage like, mental health care or, like some sort of, yeah, some sort of other aspect of healthcare. I can't think of one right now, but yeah, you get it.
No, absolutely. I think, yeah, everyone has their specific healthcare needs that they would want their, health insurance to cover. And the best way of ensuring that we have the strongest possible coverage for everyone is by, yeah, rather than sort of singling out specific issues that aren't going to be covered, by saying that we're all going to fight collectively for the strongest possible healthcare, exactly like you were saying, right? By saying everyone is going to stand up for the needs of everyone in our workplace. That's how we're going to win the strongest possible benefits for everyone. So Margot, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Pride and the Stonewall Rebellion? What were the kind of initial goals of the Pride movement, and how have things changed since those origins to what we see now, which is, of course, a lot of really corporatized corporatized celebrations in most major cities across the country. Kind of how did that transition happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really good question. It's kind of unfortunate in some ways that Pride today really has the air of sort of like mainly just like a festival or like a parade at best. And of course, I think, young queer people in particular, like, do need sort of a space to like feel like they're among community and be safe. But, under the pressure of all these vicious attacks that Sophie was talking about, they also need a space to get organized and discuss, figure out the best way to actually fight back against these things and win victories. And I think a lot of people just don't really see that in Pride right now. So on one hand, I think the corporatization of Pride is a sign that the queer rights movement has made genuinely historic strides. And you can see that in public consciousness and just like how much, as Sophie was pointing to, like the acceptance and support for queer issues has gone up. And it's forced society under capitalism to make real changes against the horrific treatment and discrimination against queer people, against like trans and gay people. But on the other hand, yeah, it points to this really sort of like dangerous co-option of the movement. So it's really crucial that you're asking this question. And we really need to understand the history of the queer movement in the States. And it looks very different from the Pride events we see today. I think most people think of the Stonewall Rebellion in 1969 as sort of the start of Pride as we know it. This was an uprising that broke out in New York in response to repeated police raids of the few queer establishments that were able to operate. And people were, harassed, humiliated, groped, and so far as beaten by the cops. And that night in June, the working class queer people there waged a serious fight back and actually broadened out into several days of protests and actions, not just from those queer people, but from, all sorts of working people who saw what was happening and wanted to be a part of it. And of course, they'd had experience of mistreatment at the hands of the police as well. And there really hadn't been an organized expression of the queer movement in the States up until that point. And I think there's kind of this idea that Stonewall was just sort of like spontaneous, they just got like angry and like somebody threw the first stone or whatever. But I don't think you can really understand that sort of like explosion outside of the context of the huge movements of that decade. The civil rights movement, the feminist struggle, of course, the anti-Vietnam War struggle, not to mention international events like the struggle in France a year earlier in 1968, where there were repeated general strikes. And it was honestly on the table that there could be a revolutionary struggle to do away with capitalism. But you have this situation where working people of all backgrounds now have this experience of these mass struggles in the streets against war and oppression. And that, I think that experience carrying over was what really led to the birth of the organized queer rights movement in the United States. Out of the Stonewall Rebellion, you had these groups springing up like the Gay Liberation Front, for the first time, like an organized expression of the queer movement. But unfortunately, a lot of these groups didn't really last that long. And I think this was really because of an inability to reach sort of a unified political set of goals, approach. And you saw this with a lot of like organizations and movements that sort of sprung up in the, new left at the time, where, there were elements of the movement that had these farther reaching like anti-capitalist ideas. And there were, elements that wanted to have like further demands, but there was this failure to reach clarity on like what political approach is actually necessary to win these things. And I think the question of like, do we trust the Democrats, was a really big part of that. Like, do we sort of like soften our demands to be palatable? Do we go all the way and up in everybody's faces, right? And there just like wasn't cohesion. And unfortunately, that caused a lot of groups to fall apart. Going into the 80s, you have two things: the beginning of the AIDS epidemic and the beginning of the neoliberal era, which you have figures like Ronald Reagan in the US, Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And of course, the Reagan administration was wildly homophobic. For years, his press secretary treated AIDS like it was a joke. He would be asked questions by journalists and they'd call it like gay cancer or the gay plague. Just really disgusting stuff. By the time that Reagan first mentioned the existence of AIDS in 1985, thousands of people had already died. And I think between 1981 to 1990, over 100,000 people died of AIDS, which made it the leading cause of death for young people in the United States. But the issue, it wasn't just that Reagan was like a homophobe, right? It was the neoliberal policies as well that he represented, the ability of the post-war boom to continue to produce these massive rate of profits that the bosses and the ruling class had been relying on was waning. And so in order to catch up, the ruling class would impose this really strict austerity, these really deep cuts to social programs and living standards. Essentially, they were trying to make up the difference by snatching it away from everything that the working class had won, over the past several decades. in terms of welfare, in terms of protection on the job, et cetera, et cetera. Under Reagan, the U.S. ruling class carried out these really deep cuts to Medicaid, to the Department of Health and Human Services, to the CDC, the Center for Disease Controls, and plus they backed out of funding for the World Health Organization. I mean, the conversation you guys were just having in terms of, workers strike back is demanding Medicare for all. And I think it's also even really important that we take that fight beyond, a struggle for union healthcare, but we also need this broader political demand because the bosses are going to hang that over our head like a sword, right? We can take away your health care. We can take away, your gender-affirming care. And I think it's worth noting also that similar to what we've seen with Biden following the Trump administration, the Clinton administration, which followed Reagan and then George Bush Sr. at the time, really didn't do anything to fundamentally change the U.S. government's approach to the epidemic, the AIDS epidemic, and the queer movement. I think, if anything, they doubled down on the sharp attacks against queer people and also against the working class as a whole. So the Clinton administration went so far as to implement the HIV travel ban, which lasted until 2010. They pushed for don't ask, don't tell in the military. He gutted social welfare programs. He introduced the 1994 crime bill, which really basically launched mass incarceration in this country, destroyed countless lives. We're still seeing the repercussions of that. So yeah, there's a lot more to say about it. But again, clearly the Democratic Party are not these allies of working queer people that they want to portray themselves as, mainly when it's convenient, mainly during election years, right? Out of this really deadly crisis came ACT UP, which is the start of the organized AIDS movement in the United States. And that stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And they took a dual approach, essentially, of on one hand, lobbying, doing scientific research and data, but they backed that up with mass civil disobedience to really put pressure on public officials. And I think the most well-known of these demonstrations was the 1,500-strong seize control of the FDA protest, which garnered really massive press attention, even though it was in the suburbs of Maryland, where the FDA headquarters was. But they would organize, also die-ins, block traffic in places like Wall Street. They would hold up these cardboard tombstones, representing people who died or who would die if there was not urgency on this question. But yeah, this so-called inside-outside strategy of ACT UP, it was effective and it won real victories, like expanded clinical trials, accelerated research on treating AIDS, and earlier access to new anti-AIDS medication. But what made it so effective, the defining characteristic, wasn't the lobbying side of it. It was the, mass civil disobedience, the use of the movement in the streets to build pressure. I think it's interesting to note that, there's some similarities here with how we've used Shama's council office here in Seattle. It's not the same thing in that, we had an actual elected socialist in office, right? Whereas theirs was a movement essentially pressuring the Democrats. But what is worth noting is that, Shama was able to, put forward legislation through her council seat, the way we won it was by bringing out hundreds of working people, to City Hall, to protests in the street, in their workplaces as well, in order to put pressure on the Democrats. And then if they sold them out, we could use Shama's seat to really ruthlessly expose them, to be like, this is what you really stand for. You either support rent control or you don't. The people are right here. What are you about, right?
Right.
And I think it shows we can't win victories from quote unquote within the system, but we can use our elected positions to really disturb business as usual, and that requires being directly accountable to these movements. And so Shama, as an elected representative, used her office to build these mass campaigns, but she didn't look at the city council as her colleagues, She acted as a disruptor, and she used her position to expose them that these were the enemies, they were selling us out, right?
Right, absolutely.
And I think, unfortunately, that sort of approach wasn't necessarily what the two prongs of ACT UP took, and actually that led to ultimately a breakup of the movement, again, over this lack of a unified political approach. The inside wing sort of became a separate advocacy group. It was very much tied to the Democratic Party. It wasn't opposing them. And unfortunately, I think that's really essentially the strategy we've seen from a lot of queer organizations and NGOs since then, going up to today. And I think in a lot of ways, this approach of looking to the Democrats to deliver protections for queer people, this is what sort of created the really sort of toothless pride that we see today in a lot of ways. And unfortunately, I think the Democrats and liberal organizations like the Human Rights Coalition really succeeded in gatekeeping the struggle for queer rights in the 2000s and limiting it to the question of marriage equality. That's ironic and really deeply dishonest for them to sort of like pose as these representatives of marriage equality, because it was Clinton, a Democrat, who first signs the really horrible Defense of Marriage Act, that codified marriage is strictly between a man or a woman. But like other queer rights, marriage equality, it wasn't won by like NGO leaders making cozy deals with the Democrats, but it was by ordinary people, queer and otherwise, marching in the streets. And it wasn't this like symbolic thing about being accepted in society. It was concretely about economic and legal rights, hospital visitation rights that were denied to gay couples before marriage equality was won. But then after this was won, unfortunately, I think the Democrats and their billionaire backers, they used it as an opportunity to water down and co-opt the queer struggle, pose as though everything's good, we're all equal. And that is, that couldn't be farther from the reality with the escalating crises that queer people and working people face. Skyrocketing rent, lack of access to healthcare and education, lack of protections from harassment at work, and of course, all these threats, from the right wing that Sophie was talking about, up to including, now the looming threat that gay marriage might be overturned in the Supreme Court. There's a reason that we say the Democratic Party is a graveyard for our movements. And I think the history of the queer movement paints a really clear example of that. And I think if queer people are going to oppose these attacks from the right wing against them today, we need to learn those lessons from the beginning of the movement. We need to break with the Democrats, break with Biden, and we need to build that organized militant struggle that links up the specific needs of the queer community, with strong, broader demands like Workers Strike Back has put forward, just like Sophie was talking about.
Thank you so much, Margot. I think all that history is so important because, and this is something Sophie mentioned, but I think especially for young queer people, it's just so demoralizing and depressing to see all of the attacks that are being, rammed through state legislatures today against, drag performances, against the rights for trans youth to access gender-affirming care, and all of these other things. And to wonder, why is this happening today, right? We have this whole history of really militant struggle by the LGBTQ movement that won all of these historic victories. We won marriage equality. Aren't we in a different period today? How can this be happening again? And especially, I think, under a Democratic president, I think it's just a very confusing and demoralizing situation for a lot of young people to try to make sense of. And I think understanding that history and how the gains were won and then how they were eroded is really important. And this leads to my next question for you, Sophie. What has the Biden administration and the Democratic Party in general, but also the organizations linked to them, Margot was mentioning queer rights NGOs and advocacy groups that have close relationships with the Democratic Party. What have all of these groups been doing in response to these attacks on queer rights, on trans rights that we've seen over the last 2 years?
Yeah, it's a good question. One of the things that was really prevalent in 2022 to hear people talk about was, oh, well, sure, the Democratic Party establishment isn't, doing a whole lot, but you have people like Megan Hunt and Zoe Zephyr who are, fighting the good fight, which, like, it's easy to point to those two people because they were, really some of the only two Democratic Party elected officials that were really fighting back against these right wing attacks on trans people in like a prominent way. And it's worth noting that Megan Hunt actually resigned from the Democratic Party over basically the lack of support she received when fighting back against these attacks, and referred to the Democratic Party as, I believe, morally bankrupt was the exact quote. I would have to look that up, but basically saying they were no different than the Republicans on trans rights, which those are her words, not mine. But yeah, I mean, the truth is that like it's not to say that there haven't been like individual people, who maybe have been trying their hardest or something like that. But the Democratic Party historically has been bad about openly campaigning for and fighting for queer issues. And, the problem comes when you have like a nonprofit or an NGO or an organization or whatever that is tied to them. You are hamstrung by their bad approach. And so, looking at like even when the tide was turning in 2008 for like a major battle for federal legalization of gay marriage, many Democrats were pressured by the movement to support this demand. But Obama came forward in 2008, as like someone who was running for president, and said that he opposed like a blanket ban on gay marriage, but he did view marriage as being between a man and a woman. And Biden also echoed this when he voted against the federal marriage amendment for the second time. And so, the Biden administration now, despite like some kind of, like rhetorical, like, finger wagging at the right wing attacks on, abortion services and some verbal support for trans people, having the right to exist, has done actually very little in the way of actually protecting, LGBTQ plus rights. And I think it's worth remembering that back in 2008, after Obama got elected, and this is just one example, but the Democrats actually had a majority in Congress and the White House and deliberately chose not to codify abortion rights into law, saying instead that it wasn't a priority. And now, since the overturn of Roe, 26 states have either totally banned or restricted abortion access. The Democratic Party is saying that we need to vote for them in November to protect abortion rights and trans people, but the truth is, they've never been reliable fighters for either of those things. And actually, a few weeks before the Dobbs court decision was leaked in 2022, Nancy Pelosi herself was in Texas campaigning for an anti choice former Republican who was running in the Democratic primaries against a more progressive challenger. So, like, that's just one example, but, like, it shows you exactly like what the Democratic Party is. They've been calling themselves the party of Roe for the last 50 years, but they never even truly drew a line in the sand there and said like, okay, this is our thing. We're only going to run pro-choice candidates. We're the party of Roe. Even at a moment when abortion rights were being overturned across the country, they definitely don't have any, kind of heroic track record of at any point, like leading the charge and fighting for, gay rights, trans rights, whatever. And actually, Biden himself opened the door for attacks on trans athletes in 2023. And I mentioned before that there's been more than 1,000 anti-trans bills that have been put forward across 49 states since the beginning of 2023 alone. And the politicians within the Democratic Party, they would like us to believe that they want to help, but we just haven't like voted blue hard enough in the past years for them to be able to help, and like their hands are tied because they don't have like the right majorities on the right bodies or whatever. And frankly, I think that claim falls apart when you look at the experience of Shama Sawant's socialist city council office over the past 10 years and how it was used as a lightning rod for the movement. When you're a public official, you have the opportunity to use your position as a tool to build movements and reach people. And that's what Shama's office was for 10 years in Seattle. It was the office of the working class movements that put her there. And through the power of those movements, we were able to win massive victories like the first $15 minimum wage in a major city and the Amazon tax, because rather than taking an approach of saying like, okay, I've been elected, now I'm going to go like argue on your behalf behind closed doors, trust me because I have like good moral fiber or whatever, like the approach of Shama Sawant and Socialist Alternative was always that Shama was responsible to the movement behind her and acting as an extension of it, not as opposed to like the head of it, or like like kind of an ancillary wing of it or something like that. And far from being a passive ally, the council office played a crucial leading role in these movements, helping to actually organize and bring the fight forward. And that's totally different than the approach taken by any Democratic Party politicians, even like the so-called progressive squad. And I think it's one of the main reasons for that difference is that the power of these working class movements that you would be able to build with that approach is a threat to the big business donors who fund the Democratic Party. So they're not going to let you do that, right? Um, And that's just one more example of the fact that, like, you can't reform the Democratic Party. You don't change them; they change you. And we've seen it time and time again. So I don't think it's a matter of just like electing more, gay and trans allies, or like, there's that famous Harvey Milk quote where he's like, "You've got to elect gay people." I think it's more about recognizing that the Democratic Party is a party of big business. It has no interest in allowing a powerful working class movement against oppression to be built, and that's what's ultimately needed in order to fight back and win real gains for queer and trans people. Many young queer and trans people, like myself included, are super worried about the disaster that another Trump presidency would be. He is openly talking about wanting to rescind healthcare protections for trans people and pushing Congress to define gender as male and female being fixed at birth. And he's even saying that he would ban gender affirming care for minors. Like, I would be lying if I said that didn't scare the shit out of me. But I think we need to be honest about the fact that the Democratic Party created the opening for the rise of Trump over the 8 years of Obama's presidency. And that if the working class had broken with the Democratic Party anytime in the last 8 years, we wouldn't be in this dire Trump versus Biden round two situation. Trump is incredibly dangerous, but the even bigger danger in my mind is whatever monster another 20, 30, however many years of unabated lesser evilism and voting blue is going to create.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sophie. As you said, the Democrats are a thoroughly corporate party, and they have no intention of allowing a mass working class movement to develop, which is what would ultimately be needed. So on that basis, we can't rely on the Democrats to be a path forward to fight back against attacks on queer rights. What lessons can we draw from the history of the movement and from what we're seeing today that we can draw out for young people who are wondering, what can I do right now to be a part of an effective fight back against these attacks by the far right? Are there any positive lessons that we can draw out? What forces do have the potential and the power and the record historically of providing a lead and a way forward on questions like this?
I think it's really clearly a very urgent question. It was urgent a long time ago. It's especially urgent today. And we got at it a little bit. I talked about the history of like Pride and ACT UP, which used mass civil disobedience in order to win victories for the queer movement. But unfortunately, I think there was a real weakness to both of these struggles. And it was something that Sophie was getting at, when we started this discussion, which is something that we also urgently need to take up, rectify if we're going to keep building the queer movement. And that is that, ACT UP and these movements didn't take up the role that labor needs to play in fighting oppression, and this is also the case, I think, for fighting racial oppression. But the reality, as we've talked about a bit, is that most of the issues that acutely affect queer people are issues that working people all face more broadly. Queer youth are, I think, more than like a quarter of them, will have faced homelessness or housing insecurity. But the housing crisis, ridiculous rents, the fight for rent control is a fight that affects all working people. And similar to what we talked about with access to healthcare, including mental health care, where queer people are disproportionately at risk of depression and suicide and so on. And the reality is that ending oppression, in the workplace and more broadly in society, it's a really urgent task for all working people in order to strengthen our movements, right? It just, in order to not do so fundamentally divides us, like we were getting at earlier. Racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, these are all tools that the bosses use deliberately, to divide us in our daily lives. But I think especially in workplace struggle, and, we were talking about this question of like, should you bring up, gender-affirming care in your union? Will that be like a dividing line? I think a really important recent example of this is when in one of their, many union-busting tactics, Starbucks executives threatened unionizing stores that their trans workers would potentially lose their gender-affirming healthcare. And of course, a threat like that is illegal, but that doesn't stop them, right? And it does create this situation, like with what Sophie was talking about, where it's an intimidation tactic, it's a division tactic. It's like, oh, for this group of workers, is it worth it to stick my neck out knowing that I risk this? And the reality is that the labor movement needs a strong answer to that, in the same way that we've seen Amazon, at KCVG in Kentucky, really targeting and attacking immigrant workers, or the sort of racist attacks they made at JFK and Long Island. These attacks are designed to turn workers against each other, and they distract from the reality that it's the bosses that are pushing these divisions, and mistreating the queer workers, the immigrant workers, the Black workers to begin with. And so if we want to urgently organize the unorganized, the labor movement can't waffle on these questions, right? We need to have a clear answer. And what that looks like in practice is a real bottom-up fight, for concrete demands that will benefit queer workers, like we discussed with access to gender-affirming care, and protections against, workplace harassment and discrimination, but also just being clear that in order for, queer workers to be able to keep their position in the workplace, to stay in the cities they live in, higher wages, all these things are also very relevant. But at the same time, we have that the labor movement needs to urgently take up struggles against oppression, but the broader queer movement needs the stopping power of the labor movement in order to win victories in these political struggles. The two corporate parties, they don't care about lobbying for things that are going to cut across their profits, and cut across their ability to divide workers, right? This sort of inside strategy isn't effective when it's for these working class demands, because they are fundamentally at odds,
Right.
with what they need to guarantee their profits. And so the only thing that can make them listen are these mass movements in the street, but more importantly, strikes, that target these profits directly. I think it's also incredibly important that unionized workers, I mentioned it earlier, but that they don't limit their organizing to immediate workplace issues, but they take up these broader political struggles, and that can be Medicare for all across the boards. But I think the fact that so many unions have called for a ceasefire and the really brutal massacre in Gaza is a good first step for that. But it's sort of cut across by the fact that, most of their union leaderships have pretty uncritically endorsed Biden.
Right.
And you really can't have it both ways. That's just the reality of it. And so I think that, members need to fight, as members of Workers Strike Back have done, for resolutions in their unions to break with the Democrats and fight for the strongest vote for independent anti-war candidates like Jill Stein, not as an end in itself, but as a concrete step towards building a new party for working people, which is what we urgently and concretely need to end the war, but also to defend, queer workers and youth from right-wing attacks as well. We need a new formation that is actually accountable to us, right? And so concretely, we need to move towards the kind of independent movement that can organize coordinated days of action, walkouts, strikes, in response to any new attacks from the right wing, or, for instance, if there was an attempt to overturn gay marriage, we need to have a serious day of action, not just day of action, but a serious organized response of the kind that unfortunately just really wasn't there when Roe was overturned. The Democrats and organizations like Planned Parenthood just really were asleep at the wheel. But I also think it's incredibly important that socialists today lead the way in making these calls in their unions, in their workplaces, campuses, and communities. That's a huge part of why I became a socialist originally, and it's also why I'm fighting to build Workers Strike Back as a nationwide movement, an organization that can help join these struggles together and discuss a way forward. I think it's just something that's urgently needed.
Absolutely. And I think that brings the question up of what Pride is going to look like this year. We, as we've been saying, are in the midst of this really awful kind of 2-year-long wave of attacks on LGBTQ rights and trans rights in particular. But at the same time, we are now in the arguably second or third year of a real upturn in the labor movement, where we're seeing increasing numbers of strikes, increasing numbers of workers going on strike, a wave of organizing the unorganized, including, with UAW, with their campaign to unionize auto workers in the South, but also Starbucks workers, Amazon. So with all of these different factors kind of at play in the background, and of course, perhaps most importantly, with this being a presidential election year, Sophie, could you talk a little bit about what you expect Pride to look like this year? And, perhaps most importantly, for those of us who are really concerned about how to build the strongest possible fight back against attacks on LGBTQ rights and build the strongest possible movement for concrete things that the LGBTQ community needs, like Medicare for all, including gender-affirming care, like affordable housing for all. What should we do in November when it comes time to vote?
Yeah, all really good questions. I think this year at Pride, the thing that's going to be on everyone's mind is still going to be the war on Gaza. That's not going to magically evaporate. And yeah, something that I remember during the Justice for George Floyd movement, during Pride Month, there was this joke among a lot of the, gay activists who were there, that like we weren't having Pride this year, we were doing Wrath instead, and that was because of the overwhelming mood at Pride events being one of anger at racist policing and wanting to do something to fight back. And so, now this year we have this, you know, literal genocidal war happening overseas. And, all the while for the last 2 years has been near constant attacks on women and queer people. I think there's going to be a lot of anger at Biden specifically. And yeah, actually, I just saw a poll recently that said a pretty significant majority of trans people were, quote, disappointed by the last 4 years of his presidency, which I think is actually saying something because I think most people, especially most trans people, didn't exactly have high hopes when he got elected. Like this year, I think it's going to be incredibly important to remember that Pride is a protest, right? And that's something that's often kind of said as a slogan. But I think there's a real conclusion that we can draw there about like what kind of thing not just are we going to have, but what would be needed, right? Uh, you know, Margot kind of alluded to this earlier, but as far as myself, I a while back I was having a conversation with other trans people about the fact that like oh, like Pride, is it a party or is it a protest? And one of the things that we were talking about is like every year we have Trans Day of Visibility, and to me it seems a little odd just because like trans people have never been more visible and we have huge targets on our backs. So this year, like, do we need visibility? Do we need a party? I think we need political action, right? Um, and yeah, I mean, many young queer and trans people have been very active in the anti-war movement over the last several months, along with the social movements of the past 10 years. Some of us, and at least the anti-war movement has correctly, I think, been extremely denunciatory about the role Biden and the Democratic Party has played in the war on Gaza. That attitude and analysis needs to be brought into Pride. We need to take the struggle for queer and trans rights to the next level by going on the offensive and fighting for things that would transform people's lives if they were won. Fighting for things like, free, safe, and legal abortion on demand, guaranteed through a nationwide trans inclusive Medicare for all, massive expansions of affordable housing paid for by taxing the rich, and rent control as a start, as part of the fight for queer liberation and trans rights and all of this stuff. Healthcare and housing. Margot, you mentioned this before too, but they're deeply tied to the fight for queer liberation, especially when roughly 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth are experiencing homelessness. Fighting for these demands would pit workers and young people against the Democrats and their big business benefactors, and would push our fights to be organized independently of the bosses and their political servants, which is the only way to actually fight and win these kind of demands. And I think that, working and young people, especially those who are queer and trans or oppose the war on Gaza or care about queer and trans people and, like should work to build a fighting Pride this year and can lay the basis for the strongest possible independent left-wing anti-war vote in November, likely for either Jill Stein or Cornel West, depending on whose campaign is stronger as the elections approach. But it's critical that this isn't just a symbolic action. It's really important that we concretely show there's a section of the working class and movements against war and oppression that are willing to break with the Democratic Party and are ready to fight for a different way forward. And it would be incredibly positive if, for example, the Jill Stein campaign took an active role in Pride protests and anti-war protests to build a movement behind, their campaign, pointing to the fact that movements, against oppression can't afford to vote blue again in November. And I think there's sometimes a hesitancy for people being like, oh, well, I'm just here to support the movement. I don't want to like make it about me or my campaign. Well, listen, if your campaign has something to offer this movement and has something to offer working people, young people, queer people, working people internationally, working people in Gaza by stopping the war, right? Then I think you should put that front and center. I think you should try to, boldly go forward and build support for those ideas, and your campaign is a part of it. But, even all of this, if it were to happen, would not be enough in and of itself. It would need to be, uh, you know, like this vote for a left independent anti-war candidate in November would need to be linked to the anti-war movement and the labor movement, and working people coming together to lay the groundwork for a new mass left workers party that can fight for everything we've been talking about today and more in an active way. And it would need to be way more than just like a ballot line to vote for, and that's what's genuinely needed more than anything. It was said earlier that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. There's a reason for that, right? Young and working queer and trans people need to decisively break with the Democratic Party and start building something new that is actually willing and able to fight for us. And unfortunately, that can't be said about the Democratic Party. It is simply not capable of fighting for us because it doesn't belong to us. It belongs to the bosses who are fundamentally not on our side. And I mean, that's for me fundamental to the fact that I'm a socialist and I'm a member of Socialist Alternative. And so I think as part of this, we need people to do all the things I've just listed, but critically, we also need people to get organized as committed activists. And I think ideally, with organizations like Workers Strike Back and Socialist Alternative, because it's critical that we not just respond to events as they happen, as like bad stuff happens, but actually prepare for the next fights, because there won't be like a final crisis of capitalism and then everything suddenly gets better, right? Things are going to keep changing until ultimately we transform society, right, and build a society that is capable of existing without war, without oppression, without exploitation, all of these things. And that system, it has to be said, just isn't capitalism.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us, Sophie, and Margot for being here in the studio with me today. In a little under 3 weeks, join us for the inaugural Workers Strike Back National Zoom Conference on the evening of Thursday, June 20th. We'll discuss strategy for ending the war on Gaza, building for protests at the Democratic National Convention, what working people should do in the presidential election, and why we need a new party. We'll have more details in the coming weeks, but for now, save the date. If you've watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Subscribe to our On Strike channel on YouTube and like this video. And become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement. By becoming a Workers Strike Back member, you can also help this broadcast. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workersstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.